Absolutely. Thanks.
Okay, wonderful. So welcome everyone. Today I've lost track of how many of these we've had, but this is the latest in our 28 for 28 webinar series. Today we'll be focusing on climate-induced displacement. My name's Catherine Lester. I'm the head of the UN Resident Coordinator's Office here in the UAE, as we are bracing for COP28, which will begin at the end of next week. Today's webinar will discuss the linkages between climate change and displacement. Today, there are over 400 million persons who are displaced as a result of climate change. This includes temporary displacement due to natural disasters such as earthquakes and storms, or slow impact that affects human survival such as droughts and loss of agricultural livelihoods, or literal loss of land, such as in Pacific Atoll nations, which was discussed in one of our previous webinars on small island developing states. So with this in mind, and noting the COP28 is the first COP to have a thematic day on the nexus of climate change and relief, today's webinar intends to deepen our understanding of the profound impacts of climate change-induced displacement. Before we start with our lead session, I'd like to invite you to post any questions you may have in the chat, and we'll get to them at the end in our Q&A segment. So I now pass the floor to Mr. Andrew Harper, who is UNHCR's Special Advisor on Climate Action, for our lead presentation. Over to you, Andrew.
Okay, thanks, Catherine. And I must admit, I was a bit surprised by that 400,000 figure. Sorry, 400 million figure, because I just don't think anyone has got any real idea in terms of the actual impacts of climate change and extreme weather events. And this is one of the challenges when you're working with a UN agency or anyone who's dealing with displacement and human security, is that the attribution of why people are being forced to move and how it could be leading to conflict can be so nuanced. But what we can say is that climate change combined with other drivers is leading to an increase in vulnerability of populations who've got the least capacity to address it. So accordingly, I've got, I believe, about 20 minutes to do the presentation on what is an extremely complex and increasingly challenging area. But as you mentioned, the impact of climate change on human security, on vulnerability, and leading to displacement is becoming much more evident and becoming much more recognized. And so you quite rightly mentioned that we've, for this COP28, there is a thematic day on peace, recovery, and resilience. And so this is a recognition, and it's a welcome recognition by the UAE that we need to have people as an example of the impact of the worst consequences of climate change. At COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt last year, it was probably the first time that displacement was on the agenda. But this year we've been able to move it forward, and this is collaborative with all our partners, move it forward in a way that the issues in terms of peace and recovery and resilience is very much at the center. Well, I would say, yeah, very much at the center, because it's on the 3rd of December, the actual day. The seriousness of the COP28 presidency in taking on this issue was also demonstrated earlier this year in early October, when we had His Excellency Ambassador Majid Al Suwaidi, the Director General of COP28, join us in going to a refugee camp in Dadaab, which was a major event, because I don't believe that there's been any previous visit by a COP28 presidency to a refugee camp. And this was particularly important because Dadaab is on the northern border between Kenya and Somalia. And so that was also probably another good example of, if there are good examples, it was probably the best example of seeing the increasing complexity of how climate change is impacting human security. And so when we took Ambassador Majid Al Suwaidi to Dadaab, he was able to talk to women, elderly, who had just recently crossed from Somalia. We basically had 100,000 people who had just crossed. And when we were talking to the women there, Many of them had been abandoned by their husbands. Unfortunately, they were there really in a situation where they had left everything behind in Somalia. And when we asked them about why they'd been forced out, it was a combination. It was an issue that the first time that they'd been displaced inside Somalia, it was due to Al-Shabaab. The second, third, and fourth times that they were displaced inside Somalia was due to drought. And so this is where it becomes an issue of why are people moving. Initially, it could be conflict, but then it could be an issue of access to livelihoods. And then when I was talking to them at the very end, and I was asking, would you go back to Somalia? And if there was peace, if there was land, if there was water, if there was livestock, they were saying under no circumstances would we go back to Somalia unless there was access to education for their children. So this is where it becomes, it's not one size fits all type of response when you're dealing with security and climate change, but this is a wide sort of ranging introduction for me. So the bottom line, climate change is a vulnerability multiplier. So it is driving displacement, and we're seeing that. We're seeing short-term displacement, often due to extreme weather events. But if we do not address the resilience of these populations, this short-term displacement becomes longer-term displacement. And this is one of the challenges, because many of our programs and partnerships in the way in which we address climate change is based on the past, when actually we're entering a period of unknown uncertainty in terms of the compounding impacts of the cascading impacts of climate change, where vulnerable communities don't have any time to recover. And so they become more and more vulnerable. And so this is one of the challenges that we've got, that, and we're seeing it again in the Eastern Horn of Africa, but I think you've also seen the floods recently in the Gulf, that without the chance to recover, people become, unfortunately, trapped in this sort of vicious cycle of deteriorating resilience. So this is one of the areas which we have to address. So next slide, if you've got control. Yep. There's countries that have got the capacity to withstand events, but there's always populations in every country who've got the least capacity to withstand those events. So even Pakistan, which is seen as like a mid-level developed country, the floods which ripped through it last year were devastating. There was like 7 to 8 million people who were displaced, and it's going to take years, if not decades, for Pakistan to recover. So if you put that in the situation of other countries in the region, and if you then sort of say, will Pakistan likely have another flood like this in the future? It will have another flood like this in the future. And if we don't help countries deal with and adapt with these situations, the impacts are just going to become worse and worse. So what as a UN refugee agency, what we're particularly concerned is that not only do we do a better job in protecting refugee locations, and refugees are people who've been forced to cross a border due to conflict, but we also need to work in a much more collaborative manner to ensure that all those countries that are hosting refugees feel that they've got the security, that they've got the capacity to respond, because it's only when hosting countries and communities feel that they have the strength to provide protection that they're willing to do that. And unfortunately, we're seeing more and more countries around the world who are feeling that they lack the capacity to be able to provide support and protection to their own populations, and as a consequence are then putting pressure on refugees. And we are also seeing that in the region, where Afghan refugees are being forced to return back to Afghanistan in a less than ideal situation. Next, please. So I spoke briefly about the situation of Somalis going to Kenya, but it's not just Somalis, it's also the situation of the host communities in Kenya and Ethiopia, which have also been impacted by drought, but now they're also being impacted by floods. And so you have this situation of not just one disaster occurring every 5 years, but you're now having situations of disasters occurring multiple times a year. So you've had droughts, you have floods, and it's not just the fact that you have a drought and a flood. You have the destruction of livelihoods, you have the destruction of livestock. In the Horn of Africa, where you don't really have very, let's say, strong social security systems, the social security and assets of many communities are based on their livestock or their food stocks that they may have. If you lose all your livestock in a region, as has happened in the Eastern Horn of Africa, where they've lost something like 12 million head of livestock, that's goats, that's camels, that's cows, there's no means to recover. And so this then means that communities who have lost everything in terms of their sustenance and their livelihoods then have to leave. And so we're in a situation where it's not only where it's not only a situation where populations are being impacted immediately by the consequences of short-term climate change or impacts of climate change, but this has a generational consequence. And so when you've got populations that, if we go to the next slide, if you have generations which are being impacted by climate change, next slide, please, then you've got a situation where they become increasingly fragile and vulnerable. And what happens then, and we're seeing it in many locations around the world, you've got populations who have got no choice but to become involved in dangerous situations. And so that could include survival sex for women in order to get food for their children. It could be men having to move from their communities and travel further afield. It could also be men joining extremist groups because you've got opportunities for them. They may not be necessarily ideologically engaged or committed, but if you can offer people who are desperate $100 or $200 a month when there's no other options, then this is what happens. This is what's driving many extremist recruitment campaigns in the Sahel or in the Eastern Horn of Africa or elsewhere. So there is a security consequence by not addressing the development and humanitarian needs up front. Next, please. So this is just a slide which tells you what we already know. The numbers of disasters that are taking place each year is increasing. It's worth also noting that this is the warmest year, or likely to be the warmest year, for 125,000 years. So no one has ever experienced the heat that we're experiencing now. So there will be a consequence, and there already is a consequence. Unfortunately, even the extreme number of disasters that are taking place at the moment will likely continue to rise. So there won't be we'll never experience a more stable period of time as we are at the moment. And that's pretty scary given the numbers of disasters. So if this is the situation, if things are only going to get worse, what are we going to do about it? Next, please. So when we start looking at the potential consequences and drivers from climate change, there are things which, and people often sort of like pigeonhole climate change and say, okay, it's going to lead to sea level rise, it's going to lead to melting of glaciers. But we have to take it to the next step and say, okay, what will it do in terms of food security? And we're already experiencing severe food insecurity around the world. As we have a tolerance for heat, as human beings have a tolerance of heat, so do crops. And so what will be the heat threshold of crops in different parts of the world, whether that be maize, whether that be rice, whether that be wheat. And with the increasing heat, you'll have entire regions of the world who, if they don't adapt their types of crops, they will lose them. Also, with increasing heat and humidity, we're also likely to see an increase in different types of diseases. And infestations of insects, locust plagues. So it's not that they won't happen, they will happen, but we need to be better able to resist and to prepare for those. So one of those challenges is that if we can anticipate that there'll be increased locust infestations, one of the best things to do is to obviously spray pesticides, which again, is not necessarily the best, but you need to be able to have access to those areas. And so what happens if you've got an insecure location like Afghanistan or Somalia or the Sahel, where you can't actually spray and defeat these plagues? So this is the type of things that we need to be looking at. Likewise, water security. There will continue to be water, but what will happen will be increasingly unpredictable. And so with increasing challenges towards food, towards livestock, access to livestock, water, then that will also have a challenge to livelihoods. How will people survive in locations where they're dependent on small farms or small herds? And so this will lead to competition over resources. So if you don't have that strong and resilient governance, which is under increasing pressure around the world, then there is quite likely to be an increase in fragility, conflict, and violence. And so who loses out in those situations? It's those people who are most vulnerable already. So when we look at climate change, we should not necessarily be saying climate change is a threat multiplier, because that's actually sort of demonizing the people who are most impacted. What we are seeing is that it is a vulnerability multiplier, and those people who are most vulnerable need to be better protected and supported. Next, please. So not everyone is unfortunately equal. Like, while climate impacts will impact everyone in the world, it is the exposure and the level of vulnerability which will lead to the potential for displacement. And so if we say hazards will continue to increase, the situation of a population being able to survive a cyclone or a hurricane in Florida is going to be vastly different to how people will survive a hurricane or cyclone in Mozambique. So you may have a similar hazard, but what are the population's exposure and what is their vulnerability? And that will then potentially lead to what the potential is for displacement. So there's so many different elements and moving parts, and when we look at the potential for displacement, that we need a much more sophisticated whole of society, whole of system approach to mitigating these needs. And this is one of the reasons why we hope that COP28 will raise the ambition and understanding of how all these different elements are interlinked. Unfortunately, in most meetings and in most conferences, including all the past COPs, you still have everyone very siloed. Everyone talks about the impact of climate change on education, or the impact of climate change on agriculture, the impact of climate change on migration or on displacement or whatever. It's all together. We need to be looking at issues of human security and seeing how climate change and extreme weather events impacts that human security, and at what point do society start breaking down? Because like, once you start having a society breaking down, that is when you start having conflict and violence. That is when you start having populations being forced to move due to no choice of their own. They've got no choice when their livestock have died, their crops have failed, the governments have abandoned them, and there's conflict. Next, please. So I've mentioned already that the impact is already against the most vulnerable. And whether you look at Islamic law or whether you look at humanitarian law or refugee law, we have to be doing a much better job in terms of protecting those people who are most vulnerable. And that's one of the reasons why we're working so hard to bring people from the affected communities to COP28, because often it's a lot of men dressed up in suits from the north talking about others who unfortunately cannot be there. So we're trying to change that dynamics a bit and have affected communities at the COP28 meeting to make sure that their voices are not just heard, but that they can also be involved in the decision making. Because unless people who are being impacted by climate change have a voice and are involved in the decision making, then nothing will change. So we need to have populations, vulnerable populations, also from conflict affected communities, from their hosts, particularly women and children, coming to these meetings. So one of the also challenges that UNHCR has got as a refugee agency is that in the past, we'd often be looking at voluntary repatriation as a key element of a solution. So there could be a war in, let's say, Somalia or Sudan or the Sahel or Mozambique, and people cross the border, but then we expect people to go home once peace breaks out. What is happening is that when you have a situation where people are being forced due to a combination of conflict and climate change, the conflict may end, but the war on the climate and the extreme impacts of the climate change is not ending. So they've got nowhere to return to, which is safe and dignified. And so this is becoming an increasing challenge where we're seeing populations who are being displaced, crossing borders, and there's no way they're going back. So we're seeing a protracted type of displacement, which will then require a much different approach. A humanitarian emergency approach for dealing with the impacts of climate change is not going to work. Next, please. It's got to be focused on building the adaptation. It's got to be focused on building the resilience of populations. One thing which we have been successful on, and this is the collective we, is that there's never been more data and evidence and trends to help us understand the situation. We know where the impacts of climate change will be. We know what the challenges will be to the populations. And the dots that you see on all these maps here, these are actually refugee and internally displaced settlements that UNHCR and our friends are involved with. But this map also represents where some of the most challenging areas will be as the world warms up. 70% of the world's refugees already come from locations which have got the least capacity to adapt to climate change. And this is the countries such as Somalia, or from Mozambique, or from Afghanistan, or the Sahel. So is it likely to become more desperate? Absolutely. So if we know that, then we've got to stop wasting our time with small incremental changes. We need a transformation in which how the whole system works, and that includes the UN. We need to be figuring out how can the UN do a better job in making sure that development gets to those locations where the needs are most. And when I talk about development, it also means the climate financing. At the moment, very little gets to the populations that need it most. Where the money goes for climate financing and development financing generally goes to relatively stable locations, and that's not making a difference in terms of addressing the people who have been left behind or the ones who are most in need. Next, please. Next, please. This is, again, just more about the same, just where we've got refugees and internally displaced people in those cities, sorry, not those cities, those countries which are most impacted. Next, please. So I think this is going to be the end of it. So we're mapping, we know where the vulnerability populations are. We know where women and girls are being forced into survival sex to get food because there's no other way to survive. We know where populations are being displaced and where the men are abandoning their families in order to join extremist groups because that's the only way which they can get money. We know how many people are crossing borders and will probably never return back to their countries, but we're not doing enough to deal with it. There's more and more refugees in the world. There's more and more internally displaced people who have been forced from their homes due to a combination of conflict and climate, but we're not seeing the reasons for these conflicts being addressed. With the retreat of member states' investment in multilateralism, we're seeing more conflicts erupt, but we're seeing very little investments in trying to find peace. And so it's only when we recognize what the human consequences are in terms of the wider insecurity of regions can we actually hope to have more investment in peace. And this is why going towards COP28, the day on resilience, recovery, and peace is going to be so important, because unless we focus on peace, then we're going to have to be dealing with conflict. Okay, thank you very much. Over.
Thank you so much for that, Andrew, and for setting out so clearly the complexity and the scale of the issue that we're dealing with. I think the numbers are staggering and they speak for themselves. We'll certainly all be watching on the 3rd of December on that inaugural day, thematic day for COP28, and hoping for negotiated and non-negotiated outcomes. Now I'll pass the floor to Isabel Michel, also of UNHCR, to touch on some cross-border international protection aspects.
Many thanks. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Isabel Michel, and I'm working at UNHCR's headquarters together with Andrew. And I'm in the team of the Division of International Protection, working as a protection officer, focusing on these situations where displacement across border occurs in relation to climate change impacts and disasters. My presentation will be very short. I will just give an overview of how international protection frameworks apply when people are displaced across borders in relation to those specific contexts and are in need of international protection. Next slide, please. So what I'm gonna explain today is based and explained in further details in UNHCR's legal considerations regarding claims for international protection made in the context of the adverse effects of climate change and disasters, who was published in 2020. And that I will certainly share as a link in the chat if some of you have an interest to read it and to refer to it. Next slide, please. When people are displaced across borders in relation to climate change impacts and disasters, they might be in need of international protection and might be entitled to refugee protection under the 51 Convention. The 51 Convention defines a refugee as a person owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or a political opinion, is outside of its country of nationality and unable or unwilling to avail himself for the protection of that country. Nothing here that relates to climate change impacts or to disasters in themselves. However, when people are displaced in relation to climate change impacts, as Andrew explained it, climate change impacts might act as vulnerability multiplier. And as such, there can be interlinkages between how climate change impacts on people's lives and on their displacement outside of their country, potentially, and persecution, conflict, violence, or other grounds that might fall under the 51 Convention. For instance, disasters can exacerbate gang violence or states' incapacity to protect victims. In other situations, for instance, drought might interact with conflict or violence. Marginalized groups, as a further illustration, could be persecuted prior to a disasters. and continue to face forms of persecution in a heightened forms, in particular in light of reduced resources after disasters. We have now in case law and jurisprudence instances where states recognize refugee status when people flee in relation to climate change impacts and disasters. As an illustration, recently Italy granted refugee status to persons from Pakistan and Bangladesh, who recognizing that climate change impacts acted as vulnerability amplifying factors to the risk of trafficking in particular. So they were granted refugee status based on membership of a particular social group in relation to their vulnerability to trafficking, but climate change indeed was recognized as having an impact, and this is what I want to highlight it here. It's not climate change as a specific or separate criteria, but climate change in its role of vulnerability multiplier in an overall protection environment. Next slide, please. Beyond the 51 Convention, there are refugee instruments, in particular in Africa and in the Americas, namely the OAU Convention in Africa and Cartagena Declaration in the Americas, that have a wider refugee definition criteria, including that encompass events seriously disturbing public order. This criteria, again, does not refer specifically to climate change or to disaster, but it can be interpreted in the context of people being displaced in relation to climate change impacts or disasters, and the impacts of such event can have the potential to seriously disturb public order. So in those circumstances, people might be entitled to refugee protection under those instruments in these specific regions. Then international human rights law might apply. In particular, people should not be returned to a country of origins where their lives might be at risks. This can be the case in the context of climate change impacts or disasters, and where there's a real risk of serious harm to people. International law says that people should not be forcibly returned to those areas where their life to be at risks. Then when people are displaced across borders in those contexts, but have no other legal option, temporary forms of protection, specific humanitarian visa programs, or other forms of stay arrangement can be developed and proposed to those in need of protection. This is the case in the Americas and in other regions. Argentina, for instance, has developed a specific humanitarian visa program for people displaced for environmental reasons in the regions. Other states do and propose now such programs. This is an emerging practice that has the potential to protect people in need. For time constraints, I'm going to stop here, but I'm available for any question. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that, Isabel, and for your time today and for that sort of protection angle as well. I think now we're going to pass the floor to Manuel Marquez, who is the head of Migration, Environment, Climate Change and Risk Reduction at the International Organization of Migration. Manuel, you have the floor. Welcome.
Thank you. Good morning, above all. I don't think there's much more that I can add than other to stress some of the things that Andrew has already said, right? there is a significant responsibility of the international community to enable climate justice by giving the opportunity to people around the world not to be displaced, by addressing not only the exposure to different hazards and disasters, but also to help reduce those vulnerabilities that would make them more susceptible to be impacted by climate change. Some of those vulnerabilities are directly connected with social economical levels and characteristics of these individuals, the communities and the countries where they inhabit. And that is also enshrined in our collective commitments through the SDG and the Agenda 2030. It's critically important, as the Secretary General said, that we keep fostering sustainable development that makes the world more prosperous, more equitable, and less risky. Combining that with the notion that risk and integrated risk on the Sendai framework is extremely important. We are in the direction, or at least we would be put in the direction of what the latest IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, has pointed: climate resilient, sustainable development. Development that is conscious of the impacts of climate change, that works to reduce risk exposure, and with this coordination, having in mind the objectives of the Paris Agreement and making all efforts to lower the emissions to reach the 1.5 ceiling, we should have, through this policy coordination, enough structure to reduce the worst impacts of climate change in some of the most vulnerable populations in the world. And this preemptive, preventive, and dignified approach to avoiding displacement, what is in the climate change we talk: avert, minimize, and address. Avert, reduce the risk of displacement; minimize, better manage displacement; and address, solve displacement. So this continuum of action that is complemented, of course, by the need to provide international protection and national protection to some individuals, is a key collective outcome of a lot of us that work in this field. So I could not urge more that all of us have this narrative of hope, that we will move forward on these conversations, and as Andrew said, that we do much more to protect people, that we do much more to reduce the vulnerabilities and the exposure of individuals. Only then we will be able to actually enable climate justice and the global solidarity that is needed towards the people that less contributed to the impacts of climate change. I think this is a difficult path, but all of you in the call and many others are very strong advocates, and where you are on your day-to-day job, there's a very important role for you on advocating for this: better finance for adaptation, more access to finance. As Andrew said, we need more people on the negotiations. From IOM side, we are trying the best that we can. We are supporting indigenous leaderships to go to COP, the civil society representatives of different groups, because all of us that have a seat as observer on the negotiations should step aside and allow others to take our chair, so that their voice is also accounted on these negotiations and further. And I would not go very far other than this, noting that from a displacement point of view, the data from IDMC has already indicated that last year, the 32.6 million people we have seen displaced by disasters represent a 41% increase from the average of the previous decade. And this is a trend that will continue. The floods in Pakistan and other events around the world point to that. And I think that's something we need to keep pushing forward and advising, that more needs to be done for governments to protect their citizens and for citizens to have a stronger voice on the decisions about their future. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Manuel, and also for that sort of rousing message, I think, for UN personnel as well. I think one of the things we've been trying to do with this platform and webinar series is to give a stage for experts like yourself in the system, for all of us to get on the same page with our common messaging, so that we can shift the needle just a little bit. We've only got 15 more minutes left, and I'd like to welcome our last speaker. Ginevra is joining us from the Peace and Security Hub at the UN System Staff College. Ginevra, thank you. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. I will just quickly share some slides to give a little bit more color to my presentation. I will try and be very brief because a lot of it has been already covered by the previous speakers. But I would like to start really with the point that was raised by the last colleague that spoke, that we need to send a message of open. We need to work on a common collective narrative. So I was asked initially to provide a little bit of a framework. How does the climate peace and security agenda comes into being in the UN and as a general international multilateral platform and discourse. So if we look at the development in the last years, I just want to show you this quote. This is a quote from Secretary General Gutierrez last year, and it's one of the first times where in a COP meeting, such as the one that is about to happen shortly in Dubai, basically he connected the impacts of climate change with the conflict. So this is one of the first times that the linkage was made in a public forum related to climate change. Now, I think the speakers before have already mentioned that there is really not so much doubt as to whether there is a correlation between climate change and fragility. If we look at this map, which was produced by Notre Dame University, we can really see that countries and regions with high exposures of climate change effects, so the ones that you can see in orange, are also overlapping with countries with identified high fragility risks. So we can see that there is here a double vulnerability arch going from the northern tips of South Africa through sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, North Africa, the Gulf, South Asia, Southeast Asia. And so how climate risks and conflict risks also overlap with high vulnerability. So if we think about it, there's approximately 1 billion people that live in countries which are highly exposed to climate change, and of which half of them, so about 400 million, live in fragile areas. So we can see here how there is a vicious circle between conflict and climate change. And in the recent IPCC report that was published, as the colleague has also emphasized, climate shocks are associated with also conflicts and impacts on the different populations, and the loop between climate and conflict is further re-emphasized, and the impact that this has on people, small-scale food producers, and livelihoods. If we think about the broad agenda, this is the new agenda for peace, which has just been has been launched a few months ago by an initiative by the Secretary General, and it's basically meant as a recommendations to member states on how to tackle the challenges of the future. And amongst the prevention challenges, we can see here that addressing the impact of climate change is highlighted as one of the key recommendations and action points for member states. And by the way, this policy, the new agenda for peace, will be part of the Pact for the Future and the Summit for the Future that member states will have to endorse in a year time, in 2024. If we look at the Security Council engagement on climate security, for a very long time, the word climate change was not mentioned in the halls of the Security Council. And let me see if I can operate these slides. Okay. Yes, so in 2007, the first discussion on climate change took place in the Security Council. And since then, in 2011, there was a first presidential statement. And then from 2018 to the present, there have been over 11 statements. So we can see how this issue is picking up in the general debate. In 2020, there was an informal expert group on climate change and security of members of the Security Council. There is currently also a group of friends, member states that are pushing forward this agenda. And in 2021, 2021, there was a draft thematic resolution that was promoted by Niger and Ireland, and it failed to pass the approval of the Security Council. But this is just to say that this theme, the connection between climate change and conflicts and peace and security, whereas a few years ago there was no mention of it in any of the official documents, in any of our narratives, today this debate is very much present, and it made into the halls of the Security Council. Now let me move quickly to the next slide. As you can see, this map shows basically all the different missions and countries that basically all the Security Council resolutions that present the language on climate, peace and security. So we have in red resolutions or presidential statements with a regional mandate. We have country-specific resolutions. Just a few that we can see here. The Security Council for UNMI, South Sudan, for the approval of the mission in Congo, UNSOM, UNITAMS, all of those missions that you can see in blue, they do have a very specific language. And in some of those mandates, even there is a mandate for the mission to conduct climate-related risk analysis. We also have regional resolutions and resolution referencing to extreme weather phenomena. Now, there is a lot of momentum for climate peace and security, for the climate peace nexus. However, I work in a interagency learning institution, the UN System Staff College, and we have been really working hard on putting together and supporting really this systemic thinking that Andrew Harper was mentioning earlier. There is a few resources that are available for colleagues who want to learn more or who need more advice on how to understand the link between climate peace and security in the different contexts. The climate security mechanism, which is composed by UNEP, Department of Political Affairs, Peacekeeping, and UNDP, and based the house of this mechanism is based in New York. Can provide you with more resources. And they also have different climate peace and security advisors that are dispatched in six different contexts. Unfortunately, I don't have the time to go into the depths of it, but I'm sure you can reach out to them. They have a page which I can link up to this chat later. So now, when we talk about resilience, and when we talked about the climate peace nexus, effectively, we're talking about the relationship between climate change adaptation, peace building and conflict prevention, and development and humanitarian aid. Now, this webinar has been focused on induced displacement, and resilience building has a powerful and important role in promoting peace in the face of climate change induced displacement. It is very important for this purpose that we understand the relationship between all these different components. Now, going back to some of the points that had been raised earlier, this is a graph from NUPI, a leading Norwegian think tank that has been studying the relationship between climate change, conflict, and human insecurity. So in order to understand that, it's very useful to look at the impact of climate change onto, of course, different, as Andrew was highlighting earlier, on different vulnerabilities and different exposures, and to understand that this impact also understand what could be the pathways between climate change and conflict, and what could be the pathways of human insecurity. And if we focus on those pathways, that could also provide us a very interesting entry point in understanding how climate change induced displacement can contribute to social, economic, and political instability, undermining peace and security. But it's also and what also has resonated with some of the presentation before. It is also true that that conflict can further aggravate these movements and can further produce more movements. So we need to understand this double loop. So amongst some of the main, the key 5 pathways that have been highlighted and identified by the climate security mechanism, there is a toolbox that they have created to support colleagues in the analysis. Mobility and migration is really one of the key ones that have been identified. And mobility and migration, we have to understand that either as a result of slow climatic, long-term climatic events, such as rising temperatures, which may mean that a certain land is no longer arable, but also sudden events such as immediate climate shocks and other disasters that have also been highlighted earlier. And of course, climate change can increase the vulnerability of populations that live in already a pre-existing state of vulnerability and could escalate further tensions with the community. So we need to, I think, looking at the pathways is a useful way to understand the relationship between climate change and conflict. The staff college, we have been supporting colleagues to how do we think about and how do we respond to climate-related risks. And I mean, I've here put 2 pictures from a training that we conducted in South Sudan with the peacekeeping mission and the UN country team. And as you can see, the first picture above, it's the entrance of the UN mission, which is completely flooded. So at the same time, the mission is also has a mandate to protect civilians, has a mandate to monitor human rights, and there's many other components to the mandate. But the biggest challenge that we have, that colleagues have shared with us is precisely how do we reconcile, the slow effects of climate change with the sudden ones, but also how do we reconcile our responses and how do we make sure that agency funds and programs and the UN peacekeeping mission who has a political mandate work in sync? How do we look at long-term sustainable intervention that can support and address the effect of climate change and therefore introduce climate adaptation and mitigation solutions, and at the same time provide peace building entry points. So if we go back to the narrative aspect that we highlighted before, I think more and more we're trying to concentrate on a narrative of hope, but also let's look at the opportunities that we can have for peace building and for climate change adaptation and mitigation through our integrated responses. I just want to share here a few of the lessons learned that we have collected because I think it could be a useful reflection for those of you also are doing intervention of the ground on induced displacement and also are looking for opportunities to promote long-term peace and stability. First of all, by addressing the root causes of displacement, such as climate change impacts or conflicts, we can reduce the potential for conflicts and displacement-related tensions, but also focusing on resilience buildings in promoting peace in the face of climate change and displacement can be also useful entry points. So the major lessons learned for us is really let's look at the long-term preventive approach. What is the political process and how can our different interventions somehow align and support the different political strategies, peace building strategies that we have in the country. So without projectizing too much our interventions, but how can we tap into all of the interventions of the ecosystem that we have of the different actors to promote peace and also to address the impact of climate change. So that also requires joint integrated analysis and programming across the different actors. How can we use multidisciplinary lenses and how can we really think systemically at the different comparative advantages of the different entities to support an approach that tackles the impacts of climate change, but at the same time promotes peace building? How can we promote in this way interagencies approach and step out of our silos Key of this is also looking at regional approaches, and by looking at regional approaches is not just looking at what's happening cross boundaries. We know that induced displacement is a cross-boundary phenomenon oftentimes, but how do we also work with regional actors and civil society organizations that are also part of the region and have perhaps a better knowledge and understanding of the context. Focus on inclusion, and this is a very important aspect of this debate. There is to date very little studies, very little understanding on climate, peace and security and inclusion. Most of the publications focus just on gender, but there is other communities, vulnerable groups that need to be considered, and we need to understand and analyze what groups they are and ensure that that the equity debate takes into account this population. I will share a note that was just published by Adelphi and Staff College, where we tried to distill some of the lessons learned that are currently available on inclusion, if you're interested. And also as a lessons learned, we all in our different domains, at our different level and on our different pillars, we are all working on climate, peace and security. We're all trying to basically address the impacts of climate change on conflict and the impacts of conflict on climate change. But we need to collect lessons learned, success stories, and we need to build monitoring evaluation systems and look at shareable indicators of where it would make most sense for our investigations to be addressed. Finally, I know that there's not enough time, but just want to share with you basically a final slide of what we're trying collectively as an international community, as a UN. We're trying to look for solutions to address these gaps, these knowledge gaps, but also to face the impacts of climate change and also understand the relationship between climate change and conflict. So we need to really identify these climate impacts and related security risks, being mindful that this analysis will need to be contextual. Every context as different. In every country, you will identify different vulnerabilities. There will be different groups and assets exposed, and there will be different climate shocks. So we cannot have, a solution that fits all contexts, but we need to really understand how in every context we can mainstream climate mitigation and adaptation and climate sensitive solutions into peace building responses, and vice versa. How can we make peace building responses more climate sensitive? We need to be better at understanding the methodologies and resources that we are available. There's an incredible amount of data, of analysis on climate, peace and security, and databases that are being provided and shared. I think there's a need to sort of take stock of all of those and perhaps learn from what we have already in-house. And sometimes organizations have a lot of knowledge which is not shared even across departments. Integration is key, as I mentioned earlier, and of course understanding the different impacts and opportunities of climate change for different groups and different vulnerable groups is also key to addressing this important gaps. And finally, at the UN Systems Staff College, what we have been trying to do is really to bring colleagues together to and reflect what are and try and create networks and moments of knowledge management and reflections on climate, peace and security. How do we understand climate risks in different contexts, and how can colleagues work together from all the different spectrum of the UN environment, and at the organizational level, how can we also learn from local civil societies, indigenous groups, and other actors that are present. So with that, I've tried to condense my presentation as much as possible, but I'm happy to take any answer as needed.
Thank you so very much. I think in the interest of time, we'll be closing this session now. I'd like to convey our deep appreciation to Andrew, Isabel, Manuel, and Ginevra for their presentations today. I think we're all now forward looking to next week and the opening of the COP. I would just mention as well that we will have our 27th in the series next Wednesday, which will be a special webinar discussing the legacy of COP27 1 year later. So with that, thank you so much for your time and to our presenters, and see you next week. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.